Have you ever given something small to a stranger, like your seat on a freezing morning, without expecting anything in return? What if that one simple act set something in motion you couldn't have imagined? Something that would change your life forever. This is a story about quiet kindness, unexpected connection, and the kind of love that finds you when you're not looking. Before we begin, if you're someone who believes in the power of second chances and stories that warm the heart and restore a little faith in the goodness of people, go ahead and subscribe to our channel. There's a new story every week waiting to remind you that miracles come in the most ordinary moments. Now lean in. Let me tell you what happened when a single dad gave up his seat and the woman who sat down turned out to be so much more than he ever expected. A single dad gave his seat to a pregnant woman at the bus stop not knowing she was his miracle. The wind sliced through the bus stop like a blade that morning, dry and sharp, sending brittle leaves skittering across the concrete like whispers of things long past. Ethan Carter shifted his weight, tugged his worn Carhartt jacket tighter, and checked his watch again. 6:42 a.m. The bus was late again. He wasn't in a rush. After a 12-hour shift, boxing meat at the local packing plant, the only thing waiting at home was the slow crawl of daylight through cheap curtains and a sink full of yesterday's dishes. Lucas wouldn't wake up for another hour, and their neighbor, Mrs. Pennington, who watched him before school, wouldn't care if Ethan came home early or late. Still, waiting had never suited him. It gave space for thinking, and lately, thinking hurt. Across the street, the coffee shop lights blinked on warm and yellow, like an invitation he couldn't afford. He looked away. A scrape of gravel behind him made him glance up. A woman approached the shelter slowly, both hands bracing the small of her back. She moved like someone carrying the weight of the world, or at least 7 months of it. Her coat, too thin for the chill, stretched awkwardly around her swollen belly. Her cheeks were flushed with cold and exertion, and when she sat down on the edge of the wooden bench, she let out a breath that sounded more like surrender than relief. Ethan watched her for a moment, then rose without a word. "Here," he said, voice rough from a night of shouting over machinery. "Take my seat." She blinked up at him, startled. "Are you sure you were here first?" He shrugged. "I've been on my feet all night." "What's a few more minutes?" That wasn't entirely true. His knees ached and he could feel the dull throb in his lower back, settling in for a long visit. But something about her made him uncomfortable in a way that wasn't about pain. Maybe it was the way her eyes scanned the road anxiously, or the tired slump of her shoulders like someone too used to being overlooked. "Thank you," she said quietly, settling in. He nodded and leaned against the metal post, arms folded. They didn't speak again. The silence between them wasn't awkward, it was tired, familiar. As if both had learned that sometimes words just added noise to a world already too loud. The bus arrived at 6:56, its brakes hissing like a sigh. Ethan let her board first, then followed and took a seat near the back. She sat across the aisle from him, eyes closed, hands resting on her belly like she was guarding something sacred. As the city rolled by outside the shuttered storefronts, the gas station where teens loitered before school, the church sign that read, "Kindness is a language the deaf can hear and the blind can see," Ethan found himself glancing at her again. She looked familiar, but not in the literal sense. It was more like a memory of something warm, something lost. He looked away. 15 minutes later, she rang the bell and stood carefully. He stood too ready to move past her. But before she stepped off the bus, she turned. "Thanks again." For the seat, Ethan nodded. "Take care." And then she was gone. He watched her walk toward a brick building on the corner, her pace slow but steady, and something tugged at him, some half-forgotten instinct. But the bus lurched forward, and the moment passed. By the time he got home, Lucas was halfway through his bowl of cereal legs, swinging under the kitchen table. His wild curls haloed by morning light. "Hey, Dad," the boy chirped. "You smell like bacon and cold air." "Thanks," Ethan grinned and ruffled his son's hair. "Finish up, bus comes in 20. He moved through the motions, packing lunch, checking homework, tying shoelaces with the practiced precision of a man who had built a routine strong enough to stand on when grief tried to knock him over. 6 years since Amanda, 6 years of bedtime stories, fevers, scraped knees, parent-teacher conferences, and birthdays with just 2 candles, One for him, one for Lucas. He didn't complain, not out loud. But some nights when the world was quiet, he missed having someone to share the silence with. After Lucas left, Ethan stood at the kitchen sink and stared out the window. The woman from the bus drifted back into his mind, not as a face but as a feeling. He wondered if she'd made it okay, if she had someone waiting at home, and then he shook the thought away. Across town, Grace Monroe stood in her grandmother's old kitchen, staring at the chipped tile countertop and the stack of unopened boxes. Her breath fogged the window as she watched the bus pull away, carrying the man who'd given up his seat. She hadn't expected kindness that morning. She hadn't expected much of anything. She placed a hand on her stomach. "Well, little one," she whispered. "Maybe we're not as alone here as I thought." The kettle whistled behind her, high and sharp. She turned slowly and reached for the mug that still smelled faintly of chamomile and dust. The house groaned with the memory of old stories, and outside a bird landed on the windowsill just for a moment before flying off into the gray morning. Grace watched it go, then smiled. "Maybe," she said aloud, "this town's not done with us yet." Grace Monroe stared out the dusty window of her grandmother's house, watching the morning fog lift off the sidewalk, like breath exhaled from the earth itself. The brick building across the street, the prenatal clinic, was already starting to hum with quiet activity. Somewhere behind its doors, other women sat in waiting rooms filled with sterile white walls and the low hum of machines. She had an appointment there in 2 days. For now, she just needed a reason to stay. The air inside the house still smelled faintly of cedar and rosewater. Her grandmother's old perfume. Grace hadn't been back here since her sophomore year of college. Everything felt smaller now: the kitchen counter, the worn floral sofa, the creaking wooden stairs. Or maybe she just felt larger, not in size, but in experience, as though life had been slowly carving its weight into her frame over the past year. She walked into the living room, rubbing the small of her back out of habit, and looked at the stack of unopened boxes labeled in her own handwriting, "NYC Office Winter Donate Baby Clothes." She hadn't touched them since the movers left. She wasn't sure why she'd brought them. She wasn't even sure she'd stay. Grace had left New York not just because it was expensive, not just because she'd outgrown the noise or the anonymity. She left because everything she'd built had come undone in a single moment when she told David about the baby and watched him blink twice, stand up and walk out without a word. That had been 7 months ago. She'd spent the first 2 weeks hoping for a call. The next 2, trying not to call him herself. After that, she stopped counting. And when her therapist asked what she wanted next, she answered honestly for the first time in months, "I don't know. I just want to stop hurting." That's when the idea of moving back here started to take shape, like fog condensing into something solid. Now Grace was 34, single and pregnant, standing in the living room of a house that felt more like a memory than a home. Still, something strange had happened this morning. That man at the bus stop, the one with the quiet eyes and oil-stained jacket. He didn't try to flirt, didn't ask invasive questions, didn't pretend she wasn't clearly uncomfortable and exhausted. He just stood and gave up his seat. No fanfare, no pity, just decency. It had been so long since anyone had shown her kindness without strings. Attached, it almost hurt more than if he hadn't noticed her at all. She didn't even get his name. Across town, Ethan rinsed the breakfast dishes and let the water run over his hands longer than necessary. He wasn't sure why the morning felt different. Maybe it was the way Lucas had hugged him a little tighter before heading to the bus stop. Maybe it was the woman's face, tired, yes, but not defeated. He hadn't expected to think about her again, but here she was, stuck in the back of his mind like a melody you couldn't quite place. He told himself it was nothing, a moment of decency. He'd done the right thing, and that was the end of it. But still, there was something in the way she looked at him, something in the way she held herself, like she'd been trying not to fall apart for a long time. Ethan shook the thought away and dried his hands. He had a long list of things to do: replace the oil in the truck, fix the squeaky hinge on the front door, pick up groceries. Life didn't slow down just because something inside you wanted to pause. That afternoon, Grace ventured out to the small grocery store on Main Street. She moved carefully down the aisles, pausing every few steps. A clerk offered to help her reach a jar from the top shelf, and she smiled politely, saying she was fine. But the truth was, she wasn't. She felt like a glass that had been dropped, but not shattered, still intact, but fragile in ways no one could see. At the checkout, the cashier made small talk. New in town, the woman asked, scanning a can of soup. Kind of, Grace said. I used to spend summers here with my grandmother. Well, welcome back, the cashier replied. The town's small, but it's got a big heart. Grace smiled, thinking about the man from the bus stop. Later that night, she lit a fire in the old hearth and curled up under a faded quilt that still smelled like lavender. She watched the flames dance and tried to remember the last time she'd felt this quiet inside. Not happy, not sad, just quiet. It felt unfamiliar. She reached over to the small side table and pulled a notebook from the drawer. She hadn't written in weeks, not since she left the city. Her hand hovered over the page and then slowly, deliberately she wrote, "Today a stranger gave me his seat without asking why I needed it. He didn't ask my name. He just saw me." She paused, then underlined that last sentence. He saw me outside the wind, howled against the window panes, and the house creaked like it was remembering something too. Grace looked down at her belly, the subtle movement inside a gentle reminder that she wasn't as alone as she sometimes felt. "We'll be okay," she whispered more to herself than the baby. Maybe this is where we're supposed to start over. And for the first time in a long while, she let herself believe it. The late November sun filtered through the tall windows of the county library, laying long golden slants across the hardwood floors. Ethan sat at one of the back tables, his son Lucas leaning over a stack of math worksheets, brow furrowed, tongue poking from the corner of his mouth the way it always did when he was concentrating. Ethan turned a page of the novel he wasn't really reading. The words swam together in a blur, meaningless. His mind kept drifting, not to the plot, not to the chapters ahead, but to the woman from the bus stop. He hadn't meant to think about her again, but something about her stillness, her fatigue, the quiet grace with which she held herself had carved a space in his thoughts. He couldn't seem to seal back up. He leaned forward to check Lucas's progress. "Need help with that one?" Lucas shook his head. "Nope. I've got it." I think Ethan smiled, tousled his son's hair. "Let me know if it tries to trick you." Just then the door to the library creaked open. He didn't see her at first. He just heard a soft cough followed by the unmistakable shuffle of cautious steps on the old wood floor. When he glanced up, his heart skipped, not in a romantic way. Not yet. It was recognition, familiarity. The pregnant woman from the bus stop. She stood near the circulation desk scanning the signs for the children's section. She hadn't seen him for a moment. Ethan debated whether to wave to say something. Would she even remember him? It had only been a shared bench and a moment of silence, but something in him stirred a gentle nudge he couldn't ignore. Lucas looked up and followed his gaze. "Hey, Dad, that's the lady from the bus, right?" So she had made an impression. Ethan smiled, unsure why that pleased him. As if on cue, Grace looked in their direction, and her eyes widened in soft surprise. Then she smiled, tentative but warm. Ethan stood and crossed the space between them, nodding in greeting. "Hey, hi," she replied, adjusting the tote bag on her shoulder. "Small town, huh?" "Very," he said, a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I'm Ethan, by the way. Should have introduced myself the other day. I'm Grace." She reached out her hand, and he took it briefly, her skin-cool fingers, slender but strong. "Thanks again for the seat," anytime he said. Then gesturing toward the table. "That's Lucas, my son. We come here on Thursdays. Homework and graphic novels." Lucas waved from across the room. "Hi," Grace chuckled. "Hi, Lucas, you're working hard." He shrugged, "Math's annoying." Grace leaned down slightly. "I used to think that too, until I realized it was just another kind of puzzle." "Life's full of puzzles, isn't it?" Lucas looked thoughtful. "Are babies puzzles?" Grace blinked, then laughed unexpectedly, hand resting instinctively on her belly. "Sometimes yes, especially when they don't come with instructions." Ethan grinned, watching the exchange. "Sorry, he has no filter." "Don't apologize," Grace said, still smiling. "It's refreshing." She hesitated, then looked around. "Mind if I sit for a moment? I've been on my feet too long." "Of course," Ethan said, moving to pull out the chair beside him. They sat together while Lucas returned to his worksheet. The library's hush wrapped around them, broken only by the occasional turning of a page or a child's giggle from the reading corner. So Ethan said after a beat, "You just moved here." Grace nodded. Sort of. I used to spend summers in this town. My grandmother passed a few years back. I inherited her house but hadn't been back until now. Sorry about your grandmother. Thank you. She looked down then, up again. It's strange coming back to a place that remembers more of who you were than who you are. Ethan nodded slowly. Yeah, I know that feeling. She glanced at him curious. You from here, mostly moved around some when I was younger. Settled back after my wife passed. Her gaze softened. I'm sorry. He nodded, accepting the sympathy with quiet grace. Lucas was 4. He's 10 now. We figured out our own rhythm. Grace didn't ask for details. She didn't offer empty condolences. She just let the silence sit between them like a blanket pulled gently over shared scars. After a while, she said, It's good, what you're doing. Being there. Showing up. Ethan looked at her. It's not always easy. The best things rarely are. They sat a while longer, not speaking, the hush between them, no longer awkward but companionable. Finally, Grace checked the time. I should go. Groceries don't put themselves away. Ethan stood as she did. Need a hand carrying things? She shook her head, smiling. I'll manage, but thanks. Lucas chimed in. You'll come back to the library, right? She looked at him. You want me to? He shrugged. You're cool for a grown-up. She laughed. Then I guess I'll have to. Ethan watched her walk away, her steps slow but steady, one hand on her belly, the other holding the strap of her bag. Just before the door closed behind her, she looked back over her shoulder. See you around, Ethan. He nodded. Yeah, see you. When she was gone, Lucas tugged at his sleeve. She's nice, she is, Ethan murmured, more to himself than his son. And for the first time in a very long time, he found himself hoping just a little that see you around might actually mean something. That Sunday, the sky hung low, heavy, with the promise of snow. Ethan sat in the garage door, rolled halfway open, letting in the gray light and the smell of pine from the nearby woods. Lucas was at a birthday party, one of those loud, sugar-fueled affairs that Ethan endured when necessary and dodged when possible. Today was a Dodge day. It gave him space he hadn't asked for, but maybe needed. The garage had become his sanctuary over the years. Workbench against the back wall, jars of screws and nails labeled in Amanda's handwriting still neatly arranged on a shelf. He hadn't had the heart to replace the labels. Her touch lingered in small things, organizing the world in a way he never could. He reached under the old tarp covering a shelf and pulled out the guitar case. He hadn't touched in years. For a while he just sat and stared at it. His fingers hovered over the latches before finally flipping them open. The guitar inside had once been honey bright, but was now dulled by time and dust. He picked it up gingerly, like it might break, or he might. A quiet strum sent a shiver down his spine. The strings were out of tune. The body a little warped, but the sound, it was still there. Raw, familiar, Ethan played a few tentative chords, then a melody, then silence. He wasn't ready. Not for that song. That song had belonged to Amanda. Across town, Grace wandered through her grandmother's attic. The floorboards groaned with each step, the light bulb above swaying slightly on its chain. She didn't know what she was looking for. Maybe something that felt like an anchor. Something that would tell her she hadn't made a mistake coming here. Old trunks and boxes lined the back wall. She opened one marked Music Nights. Inside were vinyl records, playbills. A photo album. On top lay a cracked leather journal with the initials AC, pressed into the corner. She sat cross-legged on the old braided rug and opened it. Pages of lyrics, music, notations, musings about life and love. It didn't take her long to realize what she was holding. This had belonged to Amanda Carter. Flipping to the middle, Grace froze. There in a fading Polaroid was Amanda on stage at a summer open mic night, microphone in hand. Beside her was a man with dark curly hair and a guitar. A handwritten note beneath the photo read, Ethan and Amanda, our song debut, July 4th. Grace's heart caught in her throat. She remembered that night she had been just 20, visiting her grandmother for the summer, dragging a friend to the tiny town event just to escape the heat. She'd sat near the back sipping lemonade from a plastic cup when the couple had taken the stage. She hadn't known their names, but she remembered the way they looked at each other. The music hadn't been perfect, but it had been real honest in a way most things weren't. It was the kind of performance that made a person believe in love. Grace closed the album slowly, her thoughts swirling. She had watched Ethan Carter love someone deeply, and now years later he was raising their son alone, showing quiet kindness to a stranger at a bus stop. She felt something inside her settle, not in a romantic way, at least not yet. It was more like confirmation, that he was exactly who she thought he was. That evening, Lucas returned from the party full of cake and chatter. Dad, guess what? They had a magician, and the magician made a frog appear from behind my ear. I mean, it was a toy frog, but still, Ethan smiled. Sounds magical, it was, but kinda smelly. Later, after Lucas had gone to bed, Ethan returned to the garage. He sat with the guitar again, tuning it slowly this time. Each note a memory, a story, a ghost. Finally, he started to play a soft, aching tune. Not Amanda's song, not yet, but something new, something unfinished. He didn't realize how long he'd been playing until he looked up and saw Grace standing just outside the garage door, her coat dusted with snow. Sorry, she said, voice gentle. I didn't mean to interrupt. I was walking and heard. Ethan set the guitar down carefully. You're not interrupting. She stepped inside, rubbing her hands together. That song, it sounded like something you meant to say, but didn't have words for. He chuckled quietly. Maybe it is. They stood there, the silence between them, warm despite the chill. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a photograph, the one from the attic. I found this, she said, handing it to him. Ethan took it slowly. His fingers trembled as he traced the edges of the photo. I was there that night, Grace said. I saw you two play. I didn't know until today. He looked up, his eyes, a storm of surprise and something else, something like gratitude. Small world, he said. No, Grace replied softly. The right world at the right time. Ethan nodded, folding the photo carefully, as if it were something sacred. You should play again, she said. I'm trying. And though they didn't say much more, something unspoken passed between them in that garage, an understanding quiet and deep. The kind that didn't need words, not yet. The cold came in waves that week, sudden gusts that shook the trees and turned the sidewalks slick with frost before noon. Grace had bundled herself in every layer she owned, but the chill still found its way in. She had planned only a short walk to the market 3 blocks down, just enough to stretch her legs and get some fresh air. The baby, now 7 months along, had begun pushing against her spine in the most uncomfortable ways. Walking helped. Usually, halfway home, her left calf seized with a sharp, burning cramp. She gasped and stumbled, grabbing a lamppost for balance. The pain shot up through her leg, locking her knee and freezing her in place. Breathe, she muttered, eyes squeezing shut against the sting. Come on, Grace. Just breathe. A car slowed on the opposite side of the street. She didn't look up, didn't want to make eye contact, didn't want help. Or rather, she wanted help desperately, but didn't want to need it. A familiar ache, more emotional than physical. Then she heard the voice, Grace. She blinked, turned slightly. Ethan was already crossing the road. Jacket unzipped, his boots crunching on the frozen gravel. What happened? He asked, already beside her, concern etched into his face. Just a cramp, she said, trying to force a smile. I'm okay. It happens sometimes. You're not okay, he said gently, offering his arm. Lean on me. She hesitated for a moment, pride flickering in her throat like a stuck breath, but her body overruled it. She took his arm. Thanks, she murmured. Let's get you to the truck, he said. You shouldn't be walking home in this weather. I was almost there, she muttered, embarrassed. Almost doesn't count when you're one leg away from collapsing. His voice wasn't scolding, just steady, practical, like he wasn't trying to save her, just support her if she'd let him. The walk to the truck was slow. She leaned into him more than she intended. He smelled faintly of pine and motor oil, an oddly comforting combination. Once inside, he turned the heat up and looked at her with concern as she rubbed her calf. Got water? He asked. She shook her head. Rule number 1 of pregnancy, he said, pulling a bottle from the back seat. Hydrate or suffer the wrath of muscle cramps. She accepted it with a grateful smile. You know more than I expected, he shrugged. Amanda had bad ones too. Used to wake up screaming some nights. The mention of his late wife hung in the air between them. Grace didn't push, didn't offer platitudes. Instead, she just sipped the water and nodded. Thanks for stopping. I wasn't stopping. He said I was following you. Well, not in a weird way. I saw you from the shop window. She laughed softly. That makes it a little less creepy. They sat in companionable quiet for a few minutes, the windows fogging slightly from the heat. Then Ethan said, You want me to take you home? Grace hesitated. Can we just sit a moment? He nodded outside. The wind rustled the dry leaves that hadn't yet given up their hold on the trees. Grace leaned back in her seat, her hand absent-mindedly tracing the curve of her belly. Do you ever feel like your body isn't yours anymore? She asked suddenly. Like you're just borrowing it for a while. Ethan glanced at her, then looked out the windshield, I think. I felt that after Amanda died. Like I was operating it, but I wasn't in it. She turned to him, studying the side of his face. I didn't know what I was doing. For the first 2 years, he admitted I thought I did. Kept routines, got Lucas to school, paid bills, but it felt like holding together something with duct tape. One tug and it'd all fall apart. Grace said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence gave his words somewhere to land. He turned back toward her, but I learned to accept help. Slowly, that's the only reason I'm still standing. She smiled, her eyes soft. You helped me today. You'd do the same for me. She nodded. I think that's what scares me most, that I would. He didn't press her on that. Finally, she shifted. I should get home. I'll walk you to the door. I'll be okay. I'll walk you anyway. She didn't argue. At her doorstep, Grace paused, her hand on the knob. Would you? She stopped herself. Would you like to come in for tea? Ethan hesitated, not out of disinterest but caution. It wasn't just about tea. It never was. He looked at her carefully. If you're asking out of obligation, I'm asking because I don't want to be alone for a few more minutes. He nodded once. Then I'd like that. Inside, the kettle whistled, and the faint scent of cinnamon filled the air. Grace moved slowly but more easily now. She poured 2 mugs and handed him one. They sat in the living room, her on the couch, him on the old rocking chair her grandmother had once favored. They didn't talk much, just shared the quiet. After a while, Ethan set his mug down. You'll be okay, Grace. She met his eyes. You sound sure I am. And in the stillness that followed, she began to believe it too. The gymnasium at Maple Hollow Elementary smelled faintly of crayons, popcorn, and nostalgia. Folding chairs lined the scuffed hardwood floor, and hand-painted snowflakes dangled from the rafters, spinning gently under the breath of the heating vents. The annual Winter Lights student performance was a small-town tradition, a mashup of Carol's skits and the kind of earnest chaos only kids could pull off. Lucas had been rehearsing for weeks. His role was modest, a line or two in the opening scene, then a group song at the end, but he had taken it seriously, practicing every night, reciting his lines at breakfast, brushing his teeth to Jingle Bells. Grace sat in the 3rd row, her coat folded on her lap, eyes flicking between the program and the entrance. The seats were nearly full now. Parents, grandparents, and tired teachers, with forced holiday cheer, filled the rows, but the chair beside her remained empty. She pulled out her phone and tapped a short message. You coming? A minute passed, then 2. She was about to slide the phone back into her purse when it buzzed. Ethan. Don't think I can. Too much going on. She stared at the screen. Disappointment settling like a stone, but she understood, or at least she thought she did. On the other side of town, Ethan stood in the kitchen, arms braced on either side of the sink. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Lucas's excitement that morning had been palpable. You don't have to come if it's weird, the boy had said with forced nonchalance. But I'd like it if you did. Ethan had mumbled something non-committal and changed the subject. Now he wasn't sure what he was doing. Dishes still sat in the sink. The clock on the wall ticked towards 6:00 p.m., and snow began falling again outside. Amanda had loved those school programs. She would take a front row seat, a camera, a thermos of cocoa, and clap like Lucas was on Broadway. The first year without her, Ethan had gone alone, sat in the back, hands clenched so tightly they cramped. He hadn't been back since that chair beside Grace. The one she'd saved for him wasn't just a seat. It was a question, a challenge, an invitation. He grabbed his coat. Back at the school, the lights dimmed and the chatter died down. A hush fell over the room. The first children shuffled onto the stage, cheeks red with excitement and nerves. Grace tried to focus, applauding when appropriate, smiling at the right times, but she kept glancing toward the door. Then just as the second scene began, the door opened quietly at the back. Ethan slipped in snow, still melting from his shoulders, and scanned the room. When his eyes found her, she smiled. Relief soft and unspoken. He made his way down the side aisle, careful not to step on outstretched legs or knock over diaper bags. When he sat beside her, he let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "You made it," she whispered. "Barely," he replied. But yeah, they turned their attention back to the stage. Lucas appeared near the front, his paper antlers slightly askew, his red nose drawn on a little crooked. He spotted them both and grinned his wave, half shy, half proud. Grace leaned over. "He looks like he's going to explode with happiness. He probably is." Ethan watched his son perform with a quiet ache in his chest. There had been too many things he had missed, not because he didn't care, but because he hadn't known how to step into the spaces Amanda once filled. The final song swelled a sweet off-key rendition of "Let There Be Peace on Earth." The children sang with such earnest joy that it cracked something open inside him. And in that moment, he didn't feel like a man who had lost something. He felt like a man who had chosen to show up. After the applause, the room dissolved into a sea of coats and hugs and sticky fingers. Lucas bounded off the stage and ran toward them, his paper antlers flapping. "Dad, you came." Ethan crouched to meet him, pulling the boy into a fierce hug. "Of course I did. You were amazing." Lucas beamed. "Grace, did you see me?" "Not Trip, I did." She said, "You were a star." They walked out into the cold together. Lucas between them, still buzzing from the attention and praise. "I think that deserves hot chocolate," Ethan said. With marshmallows, Lucas asked 3. "Each," Ethan replied. As they neared Grace's house, Lucas tugged Ethan's sleeve. "Can Grace come over too?" "Just for Coco." Grace looked up, caught off guard. Ethan smiled. "Only if she wants to." She hesitated, then nodded. "I'd like that." They turned onto the path, snow crunching beneath their boots. 3 sets of footprints side by side. And somewhere behind them, the echoes of children singing still lingered in the crisp December air. The attic smelled of cedar mothballs and the quiet hush of forgotten things. Grace hadn't ventured up there since her arrival in Maple Hollow. The rickety wooden stairs protested beneath her as she climbed, flashlight in one hand and a folded blanket under her arm. The snow had picked up outside, gusting against the windows, turning the house into a cocoon of creaks and whispers. She was searching for something. She didn't know exactly what, maybe an old crib, a box of winter coats, or simply a distraction from the sudden weight of hope that had begun blooming inside her after that night at the school performance. The beam of her flashlight swept across stacks of boxes labeled in faded marker Christmas photos. Quilt's Eleanor's kitchen toward the back, half buried under a canvas tarp. She found a wooden trunk marked Amanda, music and letters. Her breath caught. She dropped the blanket, knelt down, and slowly opened the lid. The hinges creaked. Inside were neatly bound journals, sheet music, and a small cassette recorder with a plastic bag of labeled tapes. Grace lifted one, her fingers trembling. July 4th, open mic night. The date sent a ripple through her. She reached for a dusty battery pack, surprisingly still intact, and popped the tape in. A few moments of silence, then a soft crackle, and Amanda's voice, clear, honeyed, a little nervous. "We wrote this one last week. I'm still learning the bridge." Ethan's the brave one, you'll hear it in his playing. A few quiet strums followed. Then a melody began, rough but tender. Ethan's voice joined hers, not perfectly in tune, but full of feeling. Real, intimate, the kind of sound that bypassed logic and went straight for the soul. Grace sat motionless, her heart swelling and breaking all at once. She remembered that night. She had been 20, sipping flat lemonade at the town square, not expecting anything. The song had floated through the summer air and wrapped itself around her. She didn't know who they were then, but she remembered what it felt like. Now sitting in the cold attic with the recorder in her lap, she knew that was Ethan, and that was the woman he loved. Tears welled unexpected but welcome. Grace had been running from ghosts for so long, but now she was listening to one. Later that evening, she knocked gently on Ethan's door. He opened it still in his thermal shirt hair, slightly damp from a shower. "Hey," he said, surprised but not unhappy. "Everything okay? I need to show you something." She said softly. He stepped aside, letting her in. Lucas was upstairs, his bedroom light still on, faintly glowing, behind a cracked door. Grace set the cassette player down on the coffee table. "I found this in my attic," she said. It belonged to Amanda. Ethan froze. His eyes dropped to the tape, then back to her. "What is it?" "Your open mic night, July 4th. I was there that summer. I didn't know it then, but I saw you. I heard this." He stared at her, visibly shaken. "You? You were there?" She nodded. "I didn't know until I heard it again." He slowly sat on the couch, his hands folded tightly. Grace pressed play. The room filled with the scratchy warmth of memory. Ethan listened, eyes distant, mouth slightly parted. When Amanda's voice wavered through the speakers, he closed his eyes. "I haven't heard this since." He swallowed hard. "We never recorded much." She didn't like the sound of her own voice, said it was too fragile. Grace said nothing, letting the music speak. It was fragile, but it was beautiful. When the song ended, silence lingered like a held breath. Ethan finally opened his eyes. "Thank you," he said. "For bringing this." Grace sat beside him, not too close. "I think you were meant to hear it again." He looked at her. "Why now? I don't know," she said. "Maybe because you needed reminding of who you were, who you still are." Ethan nodded slowly. "I've been trying to remember the man she loved. Some days I feel like I'm close. Other days like he's gone." Grace reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small notebook. "I found this too. Her lyrics, her sketches. She wrote about you like you were a song she couldn't finish." His breath caught. Grace offered him the notebook, but he didn't take it right away. He just looked at it, then at her. "I didn't expect any of this," he said quietly. "Neither did I." They sat together, both holding memories that no longer hurt quite the same way. After a long moment, Ethan said, "Do you want to stay for a while?" She nodded. "Yeah, I do." He stood and moved to the kitchen. "I'll make tea." She watched him go, her heart calm for the first time in years. And somewhere in the background, Amanda's voice still echoed, soft and unafraid, reminding them both that love, like music, never really disappears. It just waits to be heard again. Snow had fallen heavy overnight, blanketing Maple Hollow in a hush that turned even the busiest corners of town into scenes from a painting. Icicles hung from porch eaves like glass ornaments, and the tree limbs outside Grace's house drooped under the weight of winter's quiet insistence. She stood at the window, mug in hand, watching her breath fog the glass. It was still early, the kind of early where the sky was barely pink, and the world hadn't yet started to stir. The tape from Amanda's recording still sat on her table, and the memory of that music still echoed in her chest like a heartbeat. Her thoughts wandered to Ethan, to the weight he carried, to the way his eyes had softened when he'd held that notebook, and to the way Lucas had looked at her, innocent, trusting, as if she belonged in their world without needing to prove it. She had spent years proving herself to people who never truly saw her, but with them, everything was quiet, no performance, just presence. A knock at the door startled her. She wasn't expecting anyone. She glanced at the clock, 7:12 a.m. Opening the door, she found Lucas standing on her porch, cheeks flushed from the cold curls peeking out from under a knit cap too big for his head. "Hi," he said, grinning. "I brought you something." He held out a small paper bag, folded carefully at the top and sealed with a sticker of a snowman. Grace blinked. "You walked here." "Dad's shoveling the driveway. I told him I wanted to surprise you." She knelt slightly, heart already full. "Well, consider me surprised." Lucas beamed. "Open it." She peeled back the sticker and looked inside. A pair of handmade mittens, clumsily stitched, but warm-looking in mismatched shades of blue and green. Nestled between them was a folded piece of notebook paper, with his handwriting, large crooked letters that danced across the page. "Dear Grace, I thought you might get cold. These were Mom's favorite colors. I hope they fit you." You're really nice, love. Lucas Grace pressed her hand to her chest. Lucas, these are beautiful. Did you make them? With help from Mrs. Pennington? But the colors were my idea. Dad said Mom liked green because it reminded her of leaves after rain. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Lucas looked up at her, his voice a little quieter. You make Dad smile more. Grace swallowed hard. He makes me smile too. He grinned. Then it works. Behind him, Ethan appeared at the bottom of the porch steps, snow shovel in hand, looking a little breathless and more than a little amused. Lucas. He called you left the front door wide open again? Lucas shrugged. It was worth it. Grace laughed, standing up. He surprised me. I can see that Ethan stepped up onto the porch, brushing snow off his shoulders. I swear I turned my back for 30 seconds. He's a fast one, Grace said, and thoughtful. Ethan glanced down at the mittens in her hands. Ah, so the secret mission was a success. They're perfect, she said, her voice warm. Really? He looked at her for a long second, then nodded. Good. Lucas tugged at Ethan's sleeve. Can we have pancakes now? Ethan looked to Grace. You hungry? She hesitated. I don't want to intrude. Lucas said. It's not intruding if I invited you. Ethan grinned. That's ironclad logic. Grace looked between them, the boy with his earnest eyes and crooked grin, and the man beside him who had spent years building a quiet life out of ashes. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like a visitor. She felt like someone coming home. I'd love pancakes, she said. The kitchen in Ethan's house was filled with the scent of cinnamon and sizzling butter. Lucas stood on a stool flipping pancakes with more confidence than skill, while Ethan supervised and Grace poured orange juice into mismatched mugs. It was domestic, ordinary, and utterly magical. Lucas placed a pancake slightly singed on her plate with great pride. This one's yours. It's shaped like a mitten. Grace laughed. It's beautiful. Ethan leaned against the counter, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not romantic, not yet, but something close, something steady. After breakfast, Lucas retreated to the living room, leaving them with empty plates and quiet warmth. Thank you, Grace said softly, for letting me be part of this morning. Ethan met her eyes. Thank you for not running from it. She smiled. I'm tired of running. He nodded, then looked down as if debating something. When he looked back up, his voice was low. Lucas told me last night that he dreams you'll stay, that you'll be here when the baby comes. She felt the air shift, like something inside her had been waiting for those words. I don't know what's next, she said, but I think I'm starting to want to find out. Here Ethan reached across the table, not to grab, not to cling, just to offer his hand. Open, steady. She placed hers in it. And for the first time in her adult life, Grace felt held without being fixed, chosen, without being chased. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, something else was quietly blooming. The snow had shifted from soft and steady to fierce and relentless, wind carving white corridors between the trees, turning Maple Hollow into a ghost town. Roads vanished beneath inches of ice-crusted powder, and even the familiar felt foreign under a sky like slate. Grace was folding laundry when it began an ache deep in her lower back, slow and persistent, like a drumbeat. She paused, one hand pressed to the edge of the table, breathing through it. Just Braxton Hicks, she told herself. A false alarm. But 10 minutes later it returned stronger, sharper, pulling her down to sit. She gripped the armrest of the chair and closed her eyes. Not yet, she whispered. Please, not yet. She was 34 weeks, too soon, too far from a hospital, too much snow. She reached for her phone with trembling hands and called Ethan. He answered on the second ring. Grace, something's happening, she said, voice tight. I think the baby's coming. There was no panic in his voice, only motion. I'm on my way. Ethan didn't waste time grabbing a coat. He was already pulling boots over his socks, keys in hand, as he shouted upstairs. Lucas, stay put. I'll be back. He knew the roads wouldn't be safe, but Grace was alone, and the thought of her curled up in pain, frightened, was enough to override logic. He backed the truck out of the driveway, tires crunching through snow windshield wipers, slapping at whiteout gusts. When he reached her house, he barely remembered parking. He bolted up the steps, not even knocking, and found her in the living room curled sideways on the couch, face pale, jaw clenched. "Okay," he said, kneeling beside her. "We've got this." "I called the clinic," she whispered. "Ambulance can't get through the roads until morning." He nodded, steadying her with his hands. "Then we stay calm. We keep you warm. We do this together." She gripped his hand hard. "I'm scared, I know," he said, "but you're not alone." He helped her to the bedroom, every step slow and supported. She had already packed a hospital bag weeks earlier, and it sat beside the dresser untouched. He found towels, boiled water, remembered vague fragments of the emergency birth class Amanda had dragged him to a decade ago. They worked quietly, the snowstorm howling against the house like a distant cry. The contractions came faster. Harder. "Ethan," she gasped, breath-catching. "What if something goes wrong?" He looked her dead in the eyes. "Then I'll be right here. We'll handle whatever comes, I promise." She let out a sob, not just from pain, but release because someone had said it. Stayed held the weight of fear with her, instead of brushing it aside. Hours passed like minutes, or maybe minutes like hours. Time blurred into pain and focus. Ethan never left her side. He wiped her brow, held her hand, whispered encouragement between every breath. "You're doing incredible, Grace. Just a little more. Almost there." And then after one final push and a cry that cracked the silence, the baby arrived. Ethan caught the child with trembling hands, eyes filling as he wrapped her gently in a soft towel. She was tiny, fragile, but pink and breathing and fierce. "It's a girl," he whispered, awestruck. Grace collapsed back into the pillows, tears streaming down her face. "Is she okay?" "She's perfect." He laid the baby on her chest, and for a long time the only sound was the wind easing its grip outside and the soft, hiccuping breaths of new life. The next morning the sky broke open into a blue so bright it felt like forgiveness. The snow had stopped, the plows had finally arrived, and the roads were slowly coming back to life. A nurse from the clinic arrived just after dawn, checking vitals, reassuring them both that everything miraculously looked stable. "She's strong," the nurse said of the baby, "must take after her mother." Ethan stood at the doorway, watching as Grace cradled her daughter in the gray morning light. Her face was tired, radiant, complete. "She doesn't have a name yet," Grace murmured as he stepped closer. He looked at the baby, then at her. "Want help?" Grace nodded. "What would you name a miracle?" Ethan hesitated, then said softly, "Hope." Grace closed her eyes. When she opened them again, they shone with quiet certainty. "Hope," she repeated. "Yes, that's her." He sat beside them, not touching, not rushing. "Just there. I've never seen anyone braver," he said. She shook her head. "I couldn't have done it without you." "Yes, you could have, but I'm glad you didn't have to." They looked at each other, then really looked. No masks, no fear, no past between them that couldn't be honored and carried forward. Outside, the icicles dripped in the sun. Inside, new life had already begun. The power went out just after sunset. One moment, the house hummed softly with the sound of the refrigerator and the baseboard heaters, and the next silence blanketed everything but the wind. The snowstorm had stretched into its second day, wrapping Maple Hollow in a thick, unforgiving stillness. Grace lit candles with trembling hands while Ethan tended the fireplace, coaxing warmth from the old brick hearth as he added fresh logs. Hope slept in her bassinet beside the couch, her tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm that made Grace feel like the world was still safe. Ethan returned with 2 mugs of tea and sat beside her, his flannel shirt flecked with sawdust and snowmelt sleeves rolled to his forearms. The firelight flickered over the strong lines of his face, catching in the edges of a weariness he carried quietly. Grace accepted the mug. "Thank you again. For everything." "You don't have to thank me," he said gently. "You didn't ask for a snowstorm or an early labor." She exhaled a soft laugh, curling her legs beneath her. "Still, there aren't a lot of people who'd help deliver a baby by firelight without so much as blinking." "I was blinking plenty," Ethan said. "Just internally." They both laughed, a warm sound in the quiet house. Outside, the snow pressed up against the windows like a soft wall. Inside, the fire popped and crackled, and Grace leaned her head back against the couch. This house, she murmured, hasn't felt like home until tonight. Ethan looked at her with quiet curiosity. What changed? She paused, tracing the rim of her mug with her fingertip. I think I stopped trying to run, or maybe I just let myself sit still long enough to feel the warmth. Ethan watched her for a moment, then nodded slowly. That's harder than people think. Grace turned to him. Have you ever wanted to leave Maple Hollow? I mean, he hesitated, glancing toward the window where a snow-covered world waited in silence. Yes, right. After Amanda died, I wanted to put Lucas in the truck and just keep driving. I didn't know we're just away. But every time I got close to actually packing something stopped me. What Ethan looked down at his hands, fear in him. I'd look at Lucas and think, if I leave, I'll unravel, and he'll be the one holding the thread. Grace felt something stir inside her, a tenderness too deep for words. She reached out and rested her hand on his forearm. You didn't unravel. No, he said, but I frayed at the edges for a while. A long pause followed. Then Grace said quietly, I was going to leave too. Ethan looked at her. When before the baby, before the snow, before you. She swallowed. I came here thinking it was temporary. Just a safe place to hide until I figured out what came next. I even had a list of cities, places where no one knew me, where I could disappear. Ethan didn't react. He just listened, which Grace realized was all she really needed. But then I met you, she said, and Lucas. And then, that night at the library when he called me his friend, when you looked at me like I mattered and didn't need to prove it, I stopped looking for somewhere else to be. He turned his body toward her, expression unreadable. I've spent so much of my life adapting to what people wanted, she continued, fitting myself into whatever space was available. But this, here, it feels like the first place I don't have to shrink. Ethan's voice was low. I don't want you to shrink. Grace ever. She smiled, her eyes bright in the candlelight. You mean that I do? She looked toward the bassinet where hope stirred slightly in her sleep. I was terrified I wouldn't know how to love her enough. That I'd fall short like I always had in other relationships. You haven't, he said without hesitation. You won't. I still don't know exactly what this is, she whispered, looking back at him. But I know I want to stay. Ethan reached out slowly, taking her hand in his. Then stay as long as it takes to figure it out. I'm not going anywhere. The fire crackled, the shadows danced. Grace leaned into his shoulder, resting her head lightly there, and he shifted just enough to support her without making her feel trapped. It was nothing like the love stories she had grown up believing in. It was better, slower, steadier, built not on grand gestures but quiet choosing. She looked up at him, eyes glistening. When she's old enough, she said, I'll tell Hope that her first cry came during a storm and that a man with hands full of sawdust caught her with more care than any doctor ever could. Ethan gave a soft chuckle. You're making me sound like a hero. You are Ethan, she whispered. You just don't know it yet. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. In the firelight, with their hands intertwined and the baby sleeping between them, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was a promise. And for the first time in years, neither of them felt alone in the dark. 3 days after the storm, Maple Hollow was still dressed in white. Snow clung to rooftops like frosting on gingerbread houses, and twinkle lights blinked from every porch railing and lamppost. It was the kind of winter the town was known for, postcard perfect, but not without its own quiet ache. Ethan stood outside the small tree lot behind Miller's General Store, his boots crunching over ice as he eyed the last few pines still for sale. Lucas darted between them like a puppy on Christmas Eve, face red from the cold, calling out, Dad, this one's got the best needles, before racing off to the next. Ethan smiled but stayed still. His hands were stuffed deep in his coat pockets, and his gaze wandered not to the trees, but to the sidewalk across the street where Grace was stepping out of the bakery, a sleeping Hope bundled against her chest in a sling of cream wool. She didn't see him yet, and he didn't call out, just watched her for a moment, the way you watch something you're afraid to touch too soon. Something had changed in the days since Hope's birth, not in a dramatic way. No declarations, no rushing forward, but they were orbiting closer now, like stars pulled slowly together by gravity. They couldn't deny Lucas returned, holding up a short, slightly crooked pine with enthusiastic pride. This one looks like it's smiling. Ethan chuckled. Trees don't smile, buddy. Lucas tilted his head. Maybe not to grown-ups. Grace crossed the street just as they were tying the tree into the back of Ethan's truck. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her hair tucked under a knitted cap, and she looked more alive than he'd ever seen her. Let me guess, she said, eyeing the tree. Lucas picked it. Ethan grinned. Guilty, Lucas beamed. We're putting it in the front room. It's a special tree. Grace raised an eyebrow. Didn't you already have a Christmas tree? Ethan's eyes softened. This one's for someone else. She looked at him unsure until he added quietly, for Hope. Something in her face shifted. You didn't have to do that, I know, he said. That's why I did. They drove back slowly, the tree swaying lightly in the wind behind them, the cab of the truck filled with the scent of pine and unspoken meaning. Back at the house, Lucas took the lead. We need twinkle lights and popcorn strings and maybe a paper angel, he declared. You're in charge, Ethan said, handing him the box of decorations from the attic. Grace stepped into the living room, where the first tree, taller, symmetrical, respectable, already stood dressed in white lights and gold ornaments. But this second tree, shorter and slightly lopsided, was set up near the window where the morning light hit. Best I wanted her to have something of her own, Ethan said, nodding to the little tree. Grace touched one of the bare branches gently. She will because of you. They decorated it slowly, all three of them. Lucas looping paper chains, Grace untangling a mess of colored lights, and Ethan pretending not to notice that the popcorn kept disappearing between each string. Hope slept in a basket nearby the fire, crackling softly behind her. When they were nearly done, Lucas held up a folded piece of construction paper, cut into the shape of a heart. I made this for the top, he said. We don't have an angel, but hearts are better. He climbed onto a stool and placed it carefully on the highest branch he could reach. There, he said, satisfied. Perfect, Ethan watched as Grace stepped back and looked at the tree. Really looked. The colored lights blinked gently. The paper heart wobbled slightly and she nodded, eyes damp but smiling. Later, after Lucas had fallen asleep in a nest of pillows by the fire, Ethan walked Grace to the door. Hope was dozing again in her sling, warm and soft against her chest. Thank you, she said. For all of this, I just wanted her to feel welcome, he replied. She does, Grace looked at him. I do. Ethan hesitated. I meant what I said before. There's a place here for you, both of you. Grace looked down, her voice quiet. It's scary, I know, but when I think about leaving, I can't picture it anymore. Ethan stepped closer, his voice low. Then don't. For a moment, neither moved. The snow began to fall again outside, soft and slow, catching in the lamplight. Then Grace said something he wouldn't forget. I used to think miracles were big things. Lightning bolts answered prayers, second chances, but maybe they're just warm rooms and two trees and a man who shows up when it matters most. Ethan didn't respond with words. He just reached out and gently brushed a snowflake from her hair. Good night, Grace. Good night, Ethan. And when she stepped into the snow and walked back toward her house, her footsteps slow and sure. He stayed at the door watching her until she disappeared around the corner, feeling for the first time in years that Christmas had come early after all. The first Christmas morning Grace had ever spent in Maple Hollow dawned with a sky the color of lavender cream. Snowflakes drifted lazily past the windows, as if reluctant to fall, catching on the edges of pine boughs and twinkling lights. Inside the little house, the warmth was not just from the fire crackling in the hearth or the old radiator humming steadily. It was from something deeper. Something alive. Lucas was the first to stir, of course. He barreled into the living room in socked feet, eyes wide, hair a glorious mess of sleep and excitement. Santa came, he yelled as if the house might not yet know. Grace emerged a moment later from the guest room, though by now it was no longer guest anything. She wore one of Ethan's flannel shirts over her pajamas, and Hope was cradled in her arms wrapped in a soft red blanket Lucas had chosen from the store, because babies deserve holiday magic too. Ethan was already in the kitchen, flipping pancakes, the same cinnamon batter he'd made the morning. Hope was born. This time, though, his movements were lighter, his smile unburdened. There was music playing softly from an old radio, Bing Crosby's White Christmas, and the scent of nutmeg floated through the house. After breakfast, they gathered by the smaller tree, the one they decorated just for Hope. It leaned slightly to the left, the paper heart atop it now dusted in glitter, thanks to one of Lucas's improvements. Grace settled into the couch, Hope sleeping soundly against her chest, while Ethan lowered himself beside her, and Lucas perched cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by crumpled wrapping paper and squeaky toys. "Hey," Lucas said, looking up at them with all the weight and sincerity a 10-year-old could summon. "Can we keep doing this?" Doing what Ethan asked. This Christmas trees, pancakes. All of us. Grace and Ethan exchanged a glance. No need to speak. The answer was already known. "Yes," Grace said, "we can." Lucas nodded and returned to examining his toy truck, satisfied. As the morning wore on, neighbors stopped by with baked goods and warm greetings. Mrs. Pennington brought a tin of oatmeal raisin cookies, declaring Hope the most civilized baby she'd ever met. Even old Mr. Garvey from down the road came to the door with a pine-scented candle and the stiffest smile his weathered face could muster. By afternoon, the house had settled into the quiet rhythm only love could create. Lucas was upstairs playing, and Grace stood by the window watching the soft flurry outside. Ethan came up behind her, slipping an arm gently around her waist. "It feels like she's always been here," Grace whispered, looking down at Hope. "She has," Ethan said softly, "in the shape of the space we didn't know was waiting for her." Grace turned to face him. "And what about me?" He didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. "You filled a space I thought would always stay empty." Her eyes glistened, but not with sadness. "I never thought I'd be someone's home." "You were mine," he said before either of us realized it. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they stood like that for a long time, letting the moment settle into their bones. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the snow in gold, and rose, the three of them bundled up and walked to the bus stop at the corner. The same one where it had all begun. Lucas trotted ahead, leaving tiny boot prints in the snow. Ethan and Grace followed, Hope nestled between them in a soft wool wrap. When they reached the bench, Ethan brushed the snow off and motioned for her to sit. Grace hesitated, then smiled, sinking down onto the cold wood. Deja vu. Ethan sat beside her, their shoulders touching. "You were right here. And you gave me your seat," she said. "I never forgot." He turned toward her, eyes serious beneath the softness. "That day, I thought I was just being polite. Just tired, but it changed everything." Grace looked down at Hope, who stirred slightly, then back at Ethan. "It changed everything for me, too." They sat in silence as snow fell gently around them, the world hushed and holy. Then Lucas shouted from down the street, "Come on, you guys! The cocoa's not going to drink itself." Ethan stood brushing snow from his coat, then reached out his hand to Grace. She took it, and he pulled her gently to her feet. As they turned to go, she glanced back at the bench. For a long time, she had thought of herself as the woman who was given a seat. But now she knew better. She hadn't been given a seat. She had been given a beginning. And that bench, once cold and empty, was no longer just a place to wait. It was a place where hope had first taken root, where love had quietly, patiently begun, where miracles, it turned out, didn't need to arrive loudly. Sometimes they just sit beside you on cold mornings in quiet towns and ask nothing more than to be noticed. And this time Grace noticed. With her heart open, her child safe, and a hand firmly in hers, she stepped forward into the future. Not afraid, not alone. At last home. Where in the world are you watching from? We love hearing from our amazing viewers across the globe. So drop a comment and let us know where you're tuning in from and what part of the story touched you the most. If you enjoyed this story and believe the world could use more kindness, hope, and heart-healing moments, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new episode. Thank you so much for watching and spending time with us today. Your presence here means more than you know. Until next time, take care, stay kind, and keep believing in small miracles.